I got started in photography kind of out of a necessity to create. I lived in Florida. I ran a small home-based recording studio for a few years. When I moved to North Carolina, the house that I moved to happened to be kind of under the final approach for the regional airport, and it was not really conducive to a recording studio setting with airplanes flying overhead. So I one day went out to the local Best Buy and picked up a camera, made a commitment to go out on the weekends when I had free time and kind of explore the region. As I was out exploring these beautiful places, I would go home and I'd post the images online and I'd research more places, but then I'd see that everyone else with the camera was also taking the exact same photos that I was from the exact same locations of the exact same beautiful waterfalls and sunsets. When I was visiting some friends and family back down in Florida, we were driving around looking for some interesting places to photograph down there and ran across this old airplane graveyard. A friend and I pulled over and there was a little break in the fence. So we kind of wiggled our way through and started exploring this small little piece of land with these airplanes. And that moment right there for me just instantly got me hooked, like a kid in a candy store climbing up inside these old airplanes. And so from that moment on, I knew that that's the type of subject matter that I wanted to photograph. So getting access to these old buildings is probably the hardest, most difficult part of what I do. When I first started off, and it was still just a hobby, I would obviously sneak into a lot of different places. Once I started doing this full time, I tried to commit to doing it as legally as possible. At that point, I started to reach out to the owners of these buildings. I'd also found great success over the years in partnering with historic preservation groups. When I first started off full time, I went on a road trip with one of my best friends, and Memphis was one of the first stops on our road trip. I'd actually reached out to the preservation group to get some contact info from the owners, and we were able to photograph one of the first buildings that I shot there was the Tennessee Brewery. I ended up sending all the images that I took from these buildings back to the preservation group, and they just loved the idea that they could share these images, which were kind of captured and created to showcase the beauty of these places and to paint them in a positive light. And over the last 10 years now, every time I go to Memphis, they have a different preservation project, a different building that they're trying to save. And it's been great to be able to watch some of these buildings, such as the brewery and actually the church, which is on the computer screen back here. Both of those locations now have actually been fully restored and have been, brought back to life. And so it's been fascinating to kind of watch these places come back to life and also be a small part of the preservation efforts that are put in to save these places. Grossinger's Resort was definitely one of the places that kind of helped me form the overall vision that the whole series would eventually kind of come into. And just everywhere you looked, it was like you could just stand there and look around and you felt like you were the last person on earth. But at the same time, you could imagine the people that were once there and just the bustling, thriving nature of the resort. And this was one of the most famous Jewish resorts up in the Catskills that films like Dirty Dancing were inspired by. So many comedians got their start on the stage at Grossinger's. Musical acts from all over the country would go through there, and even different sports figures would go and spend the summers training there. When we were first there in 2009, it was relatively untouched by people. It was basically, there was moss and grass growing up on the tile work inside the pool. The old lounge chairs that people would have sat in around the pool were still sitting there. You could see the beautiful chandeliers and stuff still hanging up on the ceiling. And it was just absolutely spectacular place. About 2 years ago or so, the city actually went in and ended up tearing down everything that was remaining there. The entire place now is gone. Events like that, though, really drive me to be proactive and to get out there and find these places, because in some cases, I'm one of the last people to go through some of these buildings before they're torn down or before they fall down or burn down in some cases. The success stories that we've had with some of these Memphis properties and a few other ones are definitely the exception to the rule. That too often these places just don't get the love and attention that they really need and deserve. Their time with us is limited. From the beginning, I've utilized a photographic technique called high dynamic range photography. And it's not something I use in all of my images, but a lot of these scenes where you have the contrast of an indoor setting or an indoor light versus an outdoor setting and an outdoor light, that creates a very large dynamic range of light in a scene that can be difficult to capture that full range of light with just a single exposure. So what high dynamic range photography does is allows the photographer to capture multiple images that range from very dark all the way to very bright, and then blend those images together into a single file in post-production. And that single file contains all of that light data that you've captured across that full range. And so as an artist, that allows me to kind of go in and balance the light in some of these scenes. When I look at these buildings or the airplanes or anything like that, I don't see a pile of junk. I look at it and I can kind of imagine the stories that these places once held, imagine the people that were once associated with them. And I tried to kind of bring that out in my work. With the case of historic preservation, oftentimes that viewing a property or viewing a scene like that in a positive light can be the impetus that is needed to garner some interest with restoring a place. If someone can kind of start to visualize the magnitude and the majesty of some of these places. When I first get to a scene, I'll usually put all my camera gear down and just walk around the building without any cameras to distract me. So by not having the camera at all, allows me the freedom to just take in and kind of feel the building out a little bit. As I go through the day, I'll actually switch different lenses out. So I'll walk around with the wide angle lens at first and kind of photograph a bunch of wide angle scenes. And then I'll put on a very narrow macro lens and photograph some detail shots. Sometimes when I'm just going for the obvious shot, I try to think of that and say, okay, what's not the obvious shot here? What's the weird shot? What's a weird, funky angle that I can get at, or climb up into, or go down underneath, or something like that, and try to just challenge yourself as an artist to think differently and to not go with just what's the easiest situation. I'm just very thankful every day that something that I've been so passionate about and something that I would have done regardless is also being so well received by other people out there. So it's definitely a blessing. Hi, my name is Walter Arnold. I am a photographer from Hendersonville, North Carolina. And for the last 10 years, I've been creating a photographic series called The Art of Abandonment. You can find all of my work at artofabandonment.com.